Welcome to Academic, a space for thoughtful conversation between two scholars. No headlines, no sound bites, just an exchange of ideas.
It's a pleasure to meet you, and we find ourselves here on this journey to the underworld. What got you interested in the underworld?
I suppose I was interested in the underworld above all because I was interested in German literature of the Romantic period. And German Romanticism is a movement around 1800 in German-speaking countries. And they really wanted to reinvigorate social and political life and culture through the imagination. And wanted to explore spaces that were unusual spaces where they could poeticize reality and realize poetry. And the underworld happens to be one of those very strange spaces that they explore in their philosophical works and in their literary works. And that's more or less what got me interested in this topic.
Well, like you, I'm very interested in German Romanticism. I think that's an area where we've got a lot in common. I suppose another connection point for me goes to the way that the underworld is part of our culture, or the Judean-Christian culture that we've inherited. I mean, I'm thinking of the Creed, how Christ died, suffered, he descended into hell. And that idea has always fascinated me. What does that mean? Those 3 days that are going down there, the whole notion of the harrowing of hell that comes out of it. And I suppose I inherited that as part of the Judean-Christian background that I grew up in. But then through German Romanticism and the movement that came out of it, psychoanalysis, I became more interested in the classical sources of the underground. And then this kind of huge continuity opens up from the pagan through to the Judeo-Christian and then into our own time. And it's been trying to track those various links between those different epochs, how this idea manifests itself in different ways. That's where I've been coming from on this topic.
So I was reading some of your work, and you're also interested in the Platonic tradition as well, right? The idea that, in a certain sense, we're already in a cave.
Yeah.
The cave of our illusions, and one of the jobs of the philosopher, one of the jobs of the philosopher is to get us out of the cave, to learn us how to see reality that's not obstructed by our illusory identifications and what we just immediately perceive and take as real. And that's somehow coming out of the cave is linked to a process of enlightenment, gaining knowledge, or something like that. It is fascinating then that after that process, we want to return to the cave somehow. Yeah. There's going back to the underworld is a matter of, there's something like a transformation that takes place. So if we transform by leaving the cave, then going back initiates a different sort of transformation. And I am fascinated by the way the Romantics sort of decide to go back to that place of darkness, maybe different forms of descending and reascending, and each time there's a new transformation to explore. Yeah. Do you notice that in some of the things that you do?
I do. Now, I think that's very shrewd what you're saying there. I came to the Platonic dimension quite late on, I must say, and I know that there's work that's been done on the reception of Platonic ideas, the translations that were done in the 18th, 19th century, and so on. But to a large extent, I think I came across it and thought, well, why hadn't anybody told me about this before? And that made me want to introduce that into the curriculum, hooking it particularly on the idea of German political thought, which of course then has metaphysical dimensions to it. And of course, the theme of the descent, as you say, is absolutely critical to the Republic, the idea of the cave. After all, the dialogue opens with Socrates saying, I went down to the port, and so on. So we start with a catabasis, a descent right at the beginning. And then, more explicitly, in the very famous allegory of the cave and so on. Famous, but I think, in my experience, very few people actually look at it, and very few courses actually teach it. Then that idea of descent is is part of it. Well, we start off already having descended.
Right.
I mean, that's what seems to be the genius of the idea. Yeah. We are born in the underworld,
right, yeah.
fixed into these positions and so on. And we are then looking for an ascent with all of the ideas of transcendence and overcoming and liberation that are built into that. And then, as you quite rightly said, it's also a crucial part of this allegory that having done the ascent, having got out there, having actually intuited the good and the beautiful, then you've got to go back down again. Mm-hmm. So in a curious way, in the allegory, the descent is the secondary element that you have to do. It's a decision that you make. And I wonder if a kind of taxonomy that one might introduce into what we're doing is what forms of descent are actual in the sense of it's an effort to get back down again, as opposed to those kinds of descent where you fall and it's a tumbling down and it's a descent into the depths, or a being pulled down into the depths. Really, that's the third category, and so that descent takes all kinds of curious forms, I find.
That is a really fascinating point. Because when we think just in our popular imagination about intellectual labor and a kind of effort that it takes to orient ourselves in the world, we generally think about the ascent as the part that's the most difficult. Yeah. And what you're drawing up right now is that perhaps we don't know how to descend. Learning how to descend is another form of the imagination, another form of rationality, really, just knowing how to descend, developing techniques of doing so. I think a lot of the philosophers that attracted me, a lot of the works of art that attract me are those works that pose the problem of the descent. And it quite often fails. Quite often what starts off as a controlled descent ends up into a fall. In a lot of these works of German Romanticism, for example, I'll be talking about one, The Minds of Falun or Falun. Yeah. The idea is to descend and thereby become integrated into a community, to earn one's money by going down into a mine and finding some sort of a job, finding a marital partner, and then somehow you get down there. Your imagination starts working, and before you know it, you've fallen into some sort of gravity that pulls you down there, and you can't get out of it. Yeah. So it starts out as a controlled descent, ends up into a fall. Yeah. And then, of course, depending upon how you read the text, maybe the fall is actually the thing that a lot of people need to learn too, not just the controlled descent, but the fall produces a kind of imagination to the transgressive. It produces an imagination that's not just something negative. Yeah. It's something that that enriches and enlivens and gets us to detach ourselves maybe from a too tightly connected, interwoven symbolic identification with our own communities. Yeah. So there's something even productive about falling in a certain sense that I think the German Romantics are attracted to as well.
Yeah. No, I like what you're saying. I like that a lot. And there is that Goethe poem, isn't there, where the poet narrator figure comes across the watery figure, female figure of a nymph, and then there's this beautiful line, halb sank hin, halb sog sie ihn. So he's both falling and he's been dragged down there as well, and typical Goethe to be able to be subtly combining both of those things. So there is that sense of the descent is what you want to do, but there's also a fear and a reluctance as to what you're going to find when you go down there. And Schiller's ballad about the diver, and so, I mean, it's such a rich field, isn't it?
Yeah, and it seems like the theme of the underworld is structured also with a sense of gravity, and that there's a sort of theological discourse surrounding gravity. If you think about Dante and the Inferno, for example, every time we fall, there's a very distinctive point that you're falling towards, namely towards Satan, and actually more specifically to the satanic center, which are actually the loins of Satan, the most earthy part of him, or something like that. And to that gravity, we have to counterbalance some form of light or an enlightenment. And a lot of the a lot of the philosophical texts of this period, I'm thinking of a specific genre and a philosopher named Friedrich Schelling. He develops a type of philosophy called the philosophy of nature. We would call it nature philosophy, Naturphilosophie. And he thinks about gravity and light as these two forces that structure all forms of emergence, going up from the inorganic through the organic to consciousness, in a sense, and that consciousness is somehow part of. We have to learn how to navigate these two poles, and they're not just negative, each of them. Somehow the pole under is not simply something that we want to avoid or eliminate, but we really want to remain some kind of a contact with that gravitational field, pole or something like that.
No, that makes a lot of sense, what you're saying there. And you talk about Dante and the Inferno reminds me of how we find so many of those motifs there, that sense of being lost. Then how am I going to get out of this dark wood? Well, I want to ascend, but I can't ascend because these three horrible creatures are in the way, and I keep on getting pulled down again, and so on. And it turns out that the way to ascend is going to have to be to descend. It's going to have to go to hell with, of course, Virgil as the guide. We need a guide who's going to take us here. And I suppose translating that symbolically, it's quite an amazing argument, isn't it? That the Christian poet, Dante, needs the pagan figure of Virgil to take him on this journey. And I think that's a fascinating, of course, Beatrice is going to come later on to get him up from purgatory into heaven. But the initial starting point is this fusion, would you agree, of the Christian and the pagan? It seems to be something that's what the Romantics are fascinated by as well.
Absolutely. And you see a kind of those different mythological traditions coming together, actually a kind of a eclecticism almost in the Romantic period. They're interested in the Christian traditions. They're interested in the pagan traditions, but also in Sanskrit sources. They discover the Asian and East Asian philosophies, it's Indian really, philosophies that they're also thinking about as well. And those then contribute to the richness of forms that they can then explore, forms of descending and reascending. And I would say that they really want to grab onto everything and explore a plurality actually of modes of ascending and descending.
Would you agree, though, that the idea of Romanticism or the figures associated with Romanticism have, for some strange reason, become tainted? That there's a suspicion about Romanticism, you know what I'm talking about, that there's it's sort of annexed for political reasons and so on. What's your feeling about that? Do we roll with that, or do we sort of fight back about it and try and defend it? How would you see us prosecuting the case for Romanticism?
I do think it's difficult to go back to a historical time period where we've seen how things have unfolded. We've seen how semantics can develop potentially into problematic forms. The idea of a romantic organic community where there's a close fit between the individual and the collective then kind of drifts into a more of a fascist type of register in light of the later events that happened. But I do think it's important to return back to the period in which that history has not yet been written. It's true that even at the time, that way of thinking was used to distinguish types of belonging, people that could belong within a community and people that then couldn't. And that was used as a sort of an exclusionary logic. That is absolutely true, that often there were boundaries drawn between who was in and who was out in terms of the communal forms they would investigate, and specifically the Romantic form. But these very same semantic fields, depending upon who you read, were also used to actually to question those boundaries. And actually not to close the community. So that, for example, when a romantic poet like Novalis, Friedrich von Hardenberg, writes about Christianity as a unifying figure that binds everybody together, that sounds very suspicious in the eyes of, it's hard to read that today and not think of regressive politics. However, the way he defines Christianity is so idiosyncratic, eventually says, anybody who believes in Christ or anybody who just expresses a form of transcendence, any yearning for the infinite is what I mean by Christianity. And in that sense, he defines Christianity in one sense and then undefines it, ungrounds it, opens it up in another sense. And so that it leaves a lot of room for the way our orthodoxies can sort of melt into heterodox ideas. And I think we've lost that sense for that sort of provocative sense of the Romantics. To see, we too readily associate this with something we know or we think we know, and therefore it closes us off to the possibilities of the text, which are actually quite radical if one digs.
I think my own approach is to try and do two things. The first thing is to say, just because I'm working on an area doesn't mean I necessarily agree with what are perceived to be the opinions that are associated with it. And it isn't to say, just because you're interested in Romantic thought or some of the right-wing inflections of Romantic thought, by no means implies that you would necessarily sign up to them. But they're there, and you've got to deal with them. Or explore them and see what is there of use for us, what is not useful for us, what is a warning for us, and so on. So it's to try and carve out a space where people can have a legitimate interest in it without being perceived to have signed up to a particular agenda. And I think that's hard sometimes, because I think the modern academic world often wants people to take very clear and public positions. And I don't think that's what education is about. It's about enabling the students to come to their own point of view. It's our job to inform and support them on that journey. And I think it is also the case when I've tried, for example, to bring into play the notion of the archaic, which speaks to this idea of the mind, of the subterranean nature of the soul, and so on. The idea of something which is prior to Christianity, really prior to everything. I mean, the archaic is ur, that wonderful little German prefix which makes everything incredibly ancient and so on. That I think I'd say that that's an area where I'm a lot happier talking about it in English, less happy than when I'm doing that in German because of the echoes and resonances that are there. So what I try and do there is to sort of to sift out the material, and again, as you're saying, say, well, we've got to look at the cultural context, we've got to look at the intellectual context, and it's not about reviving, it's about giving people an opportunity to find their way towards this stuff. And for my own self, I think I'd say that it's been the tradition of psychoanalysis, in particular the Jungian articulation of it, analytical psychology, offers one an excellent set of tools with which to approach these texts. That's not to bind them into any kind of archetypal categorization which would do a violence to them, but on the other hand, it's a way for you to open them up and explore them. And I found Jung and his school very helpful. I don't know whether you've made the same experience yourself or you'd take a different view.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree with that. And I think linked to this is the idea that somehow, and I'm trying to push back against this in my research and in my classes, that our learning should be sanitized, that whatever we present is somehow acceptable for consumption, and everything that we present should somehow represent, we shouldn't teach it unless we can get behind it. One of the reasons why this space, the space of the underworld, the space of the forest, the space of confusion, is so important to hold on to at this particular moment, I think there are two reasons. The first is that we, as a culture, I think, need to learn how to embrace ambivalence and ambiguity, to dwell in these imaginative spaces that are spaces of confusion, and see that not just as something that we should get rid of or marginalize, but precisely as something we need to return always to these spaces, to go back to the forest, to go back underground, and learn that that's part of our cognitive, affective capacities, in a sense, and richness that we shouldn't just be clear and distinct all the time. That this darkness is a power, it's a potential for creativity and exploration and novelty. The second reason is that this space has always been associated with risk and danger, and intellectual inquiry has something risky and dangerous about it, where we step into a dialogue, we don't quite know what's going to happen. We read a work, and before we might be confronted with taboos, with desires that we find to be very risky, or positions, political positions where we might feel compromised just reading them. And if we decide in advance we do not want to go there, then we become poor that our culture becomes impoverished, I think. Learning how to take risks, to descend in a way into the complexity of the world, that is the space that I think a lot of the romantics were trying to explore when they went there. I mean, Friedrich Hölderlin, a poet of this time, has a very famous dictum, where danger lies, there too lies the saving power. And I think we've lost touch with that sort of the dangerous nature of knowledge and what that means to go down there and to linger in these moments. Would you agree with that?
What you're saying resonates very strongly with me. I think we haven't pre-discussed this, but we're absolutely really in agreement on this point. It's how do you have it's not such a, it's not simply a question of a safe space, but you want a dangerous space, as it were, for people. And I think that's what literary texts can offer. And really, I suppose what a lot of the time I find myself doing is, what I'd really want to do is to connect my students' intellectual response and the whole sort of critical rational part of it, which is, to be sure, that's one side of the game, but also to connect with their emotions and feelings. And very often I feel there is a resistance, but particularly to lyric poetry. I love German lyric poetry, and you get wonderful anthologies, and it's just an absolute delight. But perhaps because there is so much raw emotion in there, I sometimes feel that our students, and it's not a criticism of them, it's a criticism of the educational process that's got them to where they are, that there's a disconnect, that they don't trust themselves to go with their feelings. And so it's a little bit of a struggle, an uphill struggle in terms of the imagery of assent, to get them to feel that they can do that, and to not just write about the poem in order for a little assessment box to be ticked, but to say, well, this is something which will, it'll enrich your soul. Okay, it will save you in a way. Yeah. German Romanticism, in a way, will save the world in its own shape and form. And so Jung is one tool to do that. I like the way you were bringing in Hölderlin and that wonderful quotation from the poem Patmos. It's a big favorite with Jung, big favorite, of course, with Heidegger as well. Yeah. And I think Heidegger would be another good example of a part of our toolkit that we would use as interpreters. And to be sure, boy, are there problems with Heidegger, which we all know. But I find that his work on German poetry is genuinely helpful. And so I'd want to say, well, whilst there's a sort of health warning over his political activities, or in some way his lack of political activities, I mean, his lack of resistance is for me is more shocking than any particular party membership that he held for so many years. That Heidegger can help us understand what is at stake for these poems, and that also means opening up our sense of, well, how are we das Mann, as Heidegger would say? We are this sort of predetermined social individual, and we've lost connections with that transcendent part of ourselves, with the soul, to use that language. And I think Heidegger can be very helpful in trying to articulate an approach that we can use critically, but in an emotionally intelligent way with these wonderful texts. And Hölderlin, who's so difficult, I think, in particular, benefits from a Heideggerian approach. I don't know whether you'd agree with that.
Absolutely. I think Heidegger gives you at least a dialogue partner, somebody you can discuss with and think with. And it is interesting that when I do teach Heidegger, I do bring up the background, and so many students are immediately resistant. They say, "Oh, he's a Nazi. Therefore, his entire book corpus is somehow contaminated or compromised." And as a teacher, even if I'm not taking a stance on that. But I can say, and what I do say is that a lot of very important thinkers with very progressive and emancipatory agendas have let themselves be inspired by this way of thinking without actually adopting his politics. So there is a strange power, I think, that some people have where they can detach the ideology of somebody from what they find in the text. Some people can't. Some people, it's just too powerful, and they collapse a text to its problematic ideologies. Others can detach. And so I think of that in terms of a self-conscious decision or a technique, a capacity that people have in their choice of reading technologies, how they choose to read something. And I, for one, I think there is a tendency in our culture to accept our frame of reference as the frame of reference through which all cultural achievements should be judged. And at very least in the German Romantic tradition, one sees an attempt, especially in this idea of a katabasis, as you were saying. Schelling says, the beginning of philosophy begins with a descent. One descends as if in the inferno, and one has to agree with the Dante's phrase that one must abandon all hope before one enters the gates of philosophy, by which he means get rid of your desires, get rid of your hopes, get rid of all the accoutrements and cultural baggage so that you can explore something new, potentially, and learn a different way of constructing the world. And I do think we've lost that a little bit, that literature and philosophy, the otherness that it presents us with, the difference in the way it organizes the world, is part of an induction into exploring fields of possibility that we just want to see foreclosed.
That really resonates with me, and I can just give a little anecdote or something which I think confirms what you're saying. I can remember a student come to me. We'll call her Nicole, and she wanted to talk to me about the German Romanticism we'd been looking at in the second year classes. And she said to me, well, the way you're talking about it, very different from how we talk about it in French classes. Of course, they're going to be getting something which is very, very theorized, very deconstructed, very postmodern, and so on. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the best approach for German Romanticism. And I said, well, you should think about what's really going on in these poems in relation to your own experiences. For example, because in Glasgow we're a wonderful landscape and so on. I said, do you ever go out to the countryside? Do you ever go and look at nature and have a sense of wonder? And she looked at me and said, well, so what do you mean? I said, well, a sense of wonder. And she said, oh, you mean to wander? Do I go and wander in the countryside? I said, no, I'm talking about a sense of wonder. She didn't know what I meant. And I thought this was a kind of breakthrough moment. I said, no, there's this whole thing here which for some reason you have been cut off from. And, German Romanticism, German lyric poetry is going to be the way to make the connection, but it wasn't going to be an easy one. And I thought the memory it still affects me because it was such a personal conversation, but I felt so sorry that someone was having those difficulties because of the way that they had been educated through our system.
I do think if we see what we could call critical thinking, critical reflection as a mode that is intrinsically suspicious of wonder. There are inspirational philosophers who have claimed that, and I think that's also a fascinating thought experiment to perform. But I think in terms of a cultural symptomatology, what is wrong with our culture, or why does everybody seem so miserable? And at the same time, there's all this critical thinking and nothing seems to get better. I do think that if we lose touch with that sense of wonder, or we see that as mutually exclusive with the project of critique, we're lost. There's got to be a way of thinking about ourselves as multiple beings that have multiple different ways of interfacing with an environment, of which wonder is one, of which critique is another, of which reflection is another. And one would think that there's only one way of organizing the world. And I do think that poetry in particular, is a strange object. It's strange to orient your identity and your values around something like a poetic object. It's a bizarre thing to do as a human being, and precisely for that reason is why we should be doing that. To have these idiosyncrasies that we can then express when we connect ourselves up with a poetic or philosophical object that challenges the status quo ways of thinking.
Oh, for sure. And I think that, re-establishing, reintroducing that reconnected with that sense of wonder is, that's after all Plato and Aristotle. That's the definition of philosophy, isn't it? That it starts off with wonder. That great line by Goethe, zum Erstaunen bin ich da.
Yeah.
I am here to be amazed, to be full of, to be open to this one. It's what it's about. It's what I should be as a human being. Is full of a sense of wonder and amazement, and so I think that's one of the ways in which German Romantic poetry and music and painting, which we could also talk about as well, are examples of that. Reawaken that within us. And help perhaps drive that Platonic mission, which is to help people not just be a good student and then not just go on to be a good worker, but to be a good human being.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I do feel among my students, and perhaps this is a selective category of people that come to German classes and are interested in this material, I have noticed over the last couple of years that some of them have capacious desires and interests, and they're more interested in esoteric phenomena. They're interested in pop culture. They're interested in non-Western forms of spirituality, and they're yearning for some kind of a connection that takes them out of the reductive forms of experience. And I don't think this is universal or among everyone, but I have noticed just over the last couple of years, maybe it's the experience of the pandemic and this closing of the world, where there's a real thirst for a reopening and a reattachment to as many possible things as can happen, or as you can find. And this gives me a sense of hope, I have to say, at a moment when such connections seem to be disappearing, or when we feel a sense of danger and really precarity just on the world stage, and everything seems to be melting and disintegrating before our eyes, that I do feel that there's an energy in the youth there, a creativity, and also the way they talk, which is sometimes mysterious to me, but also poetic in its way. And I think connecting to their own forms of poetry, the poetry of the now, is something that is equally important, to always feel that what we're doing is contemporary. That is another thing that I think is important, that this is not of antiquarian interest. This is one of the manifold responses to the spiritual, intellectual, and political crises of the now, in a sense.
I think it's a good way of wrapping it all together, the way you've done there. And I think it's summarized for me in a very short poem, a little four-liner by Josef von Eichendorff, where he says, "Es schläft ein Lied in allen Dingen, there is a song asleep in all things, die da träumen fort und fort, that are dreaming away and away there. Und die Welt hebt an zu singen, but the world will suddenly burst into song. Triffst du nur das Zauberwort, if only you can find the magic word." And I think that's that idea of language in a more extended form, literature, unlocking this potential to radically change our perception of the world, but more than that, to radically change die Welt, the world itself. It's a big project. Maybe its failure is kind of inevitable, but that's already built into it by the Romantics, isn't it? Through their use of irony. And that's what makes it such an exciting and a form of literature to be examining.
That's such a beautiful way of putting it. Yes, I think, and we never find the magic word, and in a way that is the magic. The magic word depends upon you, in a way, never finding the formula that can make everything good, because it can't, but just keeping somehow the ideal that stimulates you always to look for that magic word that you will never find. that openness that provokes is, I think, part of what the Romantics meant with Romantic poetry, that it's an infinite task, that it never comes to an end, and there's always something new to explore, to generate.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think that sense of the unexpected that's built into the project of Romanticism, it reminds me of another quotation which is attributed to Paul Eluard, where he says, there is another world, and this is it.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really learned so much and have been so inspired listening to you. It's been absolutely enriching, and this has just been a wonderful dialogue.
The pleasure's been all mine, Gabriel. Very glad to have met you, and thank you for sharing your ideas.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
My pleasure too.